In the Middle Ages, the crossbow changed the way battles were fought. It was powerful, easy to use, and didn't need years of training like traditional bows. For a while, it gave regular soldiers a way to stand up to armored knights. But over time, armies stopped using it. Why did that happen? It wasn't just about one new weapon or one big event. Warfare was changing. New tactics, better armor, gunpowder, and even the way armies were organized all played a part. In this video, we'll take a closer look at how the crossbow rose to power, and why it eventually disappeared from the battlefield. Number 1. Crossbow origins and impact. The crossbow was not an invention born overnight. It developed over centuries, drawing from earlier designs like the Greek gastrophetes, and incorporating innovations from both Eastern and Western traditions. By the 11th century, European armies began adopting the crossbow in increasing numbers. Its mechanical nature made it very different from traditional bows. Where the longbow required years of physical conditioning and practice, the crossbow could be taught in weeks. That made it a practical weapon for militias, mercenaries, and feudal levies, especially in cities and regions that lacked a strong tradition of archery. What truly set the crossbow apart was its power. A bolt launched from a heavy crossbow could punch through chainmail and in some cases, even pierce plate armor if the shot landed at close range or hit a vulnerable spot. This made it one of the most dangerous weapons of its time, especially against mounted knights who relied heavily on their armor for survival. That reality shook the foundation of medieval military culture. Knights, raised from childhood to believe in their superiority on the battlefield, suddenly found themselves vulnerable to commoners wielding mechanical weapons. The social implications were just as significant as the military ones. If a poorly trained peasant could kill a nobleman with a single well-placed shot, the hierarchy that supported feudal warfare began to look unstable. The crossbow's rise also brought changes in battlefield tactics. Commanders began to include mixed formations where crossbowmen supported infantry and cavalry. In siege warfare, they were invaluable, defending walls with precision and power. But their presence also forced changes in how soldiers approached the battlefield. More cover, more shields, and more coordination. The weapon didn't just shift how armies fought, it helped redefine who had the right to fight at all. The crossbow democratized violence in a time when power was supposed to belong only to the noble class. Number 2. Reloading and battle rhythm. One of the most significant limitations of the medieval crossbow was its slow rate of fire, which directly influenced how battles were planned and fought. Unlike traditional bows that relied on upper body strength and could be fired rapidly by a trained archer, the crossbow required a mechanical process to reload. The tension in a crossbow string, especially in stronger steel-limbed versions, was far too great to reset by hand. Soldiers had to use tools like a belt hook, windlass, or cranaquin, each of which added precious seconds or even longer to every shot. Depending on the mechanism and strength of the weapon, a single crossbowman might manage only 1 or 2 bolts per minute, compared to the 5 to 10 arrows per minute from an experienced longbowman. This slow reload time had direct consequences on how crossbowmen were used in combat. In open-field battles where speed, mobility, and quick decision-making were essential, crossbowmen could easily become a liability if not properly protected. To compensate, they were often deployed in tightly controlled formations, standing behind pavises, tall, portable shields that gave them temporary cover while they reloaded. These shields were sometimes carried by assistants or placed in rows in front of firing lines. In many cases, crossbow units required dedicated support troops just to keep them safe between volleys. This made them more logistically demanding than other types of infantry. The need for precise timing and coordination also influenced the larger rhythm of battle. Crossbowmen were usually placed in a defensive or supportive role, beginning engagements with a volley to weaken the enemy or to provide cover for advancing infantry. Their slower rate of fire meant they were rarely used as the main offensive component. Once their volley was fired, they needed time to reset, during which other units had to step in to hold the line. If an enemy force managed to close the distance quickly, Crossbowmen, often unarmored or lightly protected, were at serious risk. This vulnerability forced medieval commanders to rethink positioning and timing. Crossbow units could not simply be scattered across a battlefield. They had to be anchored to defensible positions, often on elevated terrain or within formations shielded by pikemen or spearmen. In siege warfare, these problems were minimized, since defensive structures naturally gave them cover and the battle tempo was slower. However, in fast-moving field battles where adaptability was key, the crossbow's slow rhythm of fire demanded careful planning, and any lapse in timing or protection could lead to disastrous losses. This drawback became one of the decisive factors that limited the crossbow's long-term role in evolving medieval military tactics. Number 3. Tactical shifts in warfare. Between the 13th and 15th centuries, medieval warfare underwent significant changes in both structure and battlefield tactics. In earlier periods, battles were often dominated by elite cavalry, heavily armored knights who charged into combat with the expectation that brute force and shock would decide the outcome. Infantry played a secondary role, often less organized, and used more to support or hold positions than to shape the main outcome of the battle. However, as conflicts grew in scale and complexity, and as feudal systems gradually gave way to more centralized military organization, commanders began to rely more heavily on infantry-based formations and standardized battlefield roles. These new tactics introduced greater discipline and coordination among foot soldiers. Infantry units began to fight in tight ranks, using formations like pike squares and shield walls to repel cavalry and create defensive barriers. At the same time, ranged units became more integrated into overall strategy, used not just for harassing the enemy, but to deliver sustained volleys that could disrupt enemy charges or soften up advancing lines. In this new framework, weapons had to match the pace and coordination of large-scale engagements, where timing and repeatable action mattered more than isolated moments of high power. The crossbow, while lethal, didn't adapt well to this tactical evolution. Its slow reload time made it difficult to use in flexible, fast-moving formations. A group of crossbowmen, once they fired their bolts, needed extended cover before they could contribute again, which left gaps in the battlefield rhythm. This problem became more apparent as opposing forces began to adopt faster firing alternatives. In regions where the longbow was favored, it quickly became the dominant ranged weapon in open warfare due to its ability to deliver consistent pressure with fewer pauses. Later, as early handguns began to emerge, they brought with them new tactical possibilities. Despite being primitive, they could be loaded and fired from standardized positions in formations that fit better into evolving military doctrine. The increasing reliance on combined arms, where infantry, cavalry, and ranged units had to operate in synchronization, further pushed crossbowmen to the margins. Their need for protection and downtime made them difficult to place in mobile armies expected to march quickly and react with flexibility. While crossbows remained effective in sieges or static defenses, they simply couldn't maintain a consistent presence in the new model of battlefield coordination, where fluid tactics and formation control were becoming the standard across European warfare. Number 4. Technological overlap and decline. By the late Middle Ages, European warfare was entering a period of rapid transformation, driven by the introduction and spread of gunpowder weapons. For centuries, the crossbow had been valued for its ability to deliver a powerful, armor-piercing shot with relatively little training required. But once firearms began to appear in increasing numbers during the 14th and 15th centuries, the strengths that had made the crossbow so appealing began to lose their competitive edge. The arrival of gunpowder weaponry did not immediately eliminate older technologies, but it created a period of overlap where commanders had to weigh the cost, efficiency, and battlefield effectiveness of both systems. Early firearms were far from perfect. They were bulky, slow to reload, and often unreliable in poor weather. However, what they lacked in refinement, they made up for with raw impact and simplicity. A basic hand cannon or early arquebus could be used by someone with minimal training, and more importantly, it could deliver a lead projectile with enough force to penetrate the hardened steel of a knight's plate armor. In comparison, a crossbow, while accurate and powerful, had limitations when faced with improved defensive gear. Against high-quality armor, especially at long range or unfavorable angles, crossbow bolts increasingly failed to do serious damage. This shift in battlefield survivability began to make firearms the more practical option. Another major factor in the decline of the crossbow was the complexity and cost of its construction. A proper military-grade crossbow required skilled craftsmanship, using materials such as treated wood, animal sinew, horn, and metal. Each weapon took time to assemble, and repairs in the field were often difficult. Gunpowder weapons, although initially crude, were easier to mass-produce once metallurgy and casting techniques improved. The ability to outfit large numbers of soldiers quickly and cheaply became a key advantage, especially as centralized monarchies and emerging states sought to maintain standing armies rather than rely on feudal levies. As firearm technology advanced, the gap between the two weapon types widened further. Muskets became lighter, more accurate, and easier to maintain. Powder and shot could be standardized, and reloading drills were introduced to increase firing speed. While the crossbow never completely disappeared and continued to be used in some specialized roles, it gradually lost its place as a frontline weapon. The growing demands of modern warfare, mobility, firepower, and cost-effectiveness simply favored firearms. The decline of the crossbow was not the result of sudden obsolescence, but a gradual shift in priorities and technology that reshaped the structure of military power across Europe. Number 5. Cost and manufacturing. The production of crossbows in the medieval period involved a level of complexity that made them one of the more demanding weapons to manufacture and maintain. While they were highly effective in certain combat scenarios, the materials and craftsmanship needed to build a functional military crossbow placed them in a category that required significant economic and logistical resources. The central component, the prod or bow portion, was often made from layers of horn, sinew, and wood laminated together, or later from hardened steel. Each type required precision and access to specific materials, and the steel variants in particular demanded skilled blacksmithing, including controlled tempering to ensure durability and the right amount of flex. The stock, or tiller, also needed to be carved and shaped to exact specifications, typically from hardwoods like yew or ash, and it had to be strong enough to handle the mechanical tension of the drawn bowstring. Trigger mechanisms involved small but crucial metal components that had to work reliably even under battlefield stress. The strings themselves were made from tightly woven fibers, often from animal sinew or hemp, which had to be treated and reinforced to handle the energy release without snapping. Taken together, these elements required multiple trades: woodworkers, blacksmiths, leatherworkers, and string makers to cooperate in a production chain that was both slow and costly. Because of this, crossbows were not easily mass-produced, and repairing them in the field was rarely straightforward. Damaged parts often required replacement by specialists, and even minor misalignments could compromise performance. For rulers and military leaders attempting to equip growing armies, especially during periods of large-scale warfare, this high cost and low production speed became increasingly problematic. In contrast, early firearms, even in their primitive stages, offered a different production model. The barrels could be cast from iron or bronze, and the wooden stocks were simpler than those of crossbows. The parts were more forgiving of minor imperfections, and once techniques for powder production and shot casting became widespread, the supply lines for gunpowder weapons could be scaled up more easily. Standardized molds and casting allowed firearms to be replicated more consistently across regions. As medieval economies began shifting from localized feudal systems toward centralized monarchies and early nation-states, the need for affordable, repeatable weapon production became critical. Weapons that could be manufactured in large quantities and used by quickly trained soldiers were far more appealing than individually crafted expensive tools like the crossbow. This economic reality played a major role in its gradual removal from the front lines, even before technological advancements had made it entirely obsolete. Number 6. Psychological and moral shifts. The introduction and increasing use of crossbows during the medieval period did more than alter battlefield tactics. It unsettled the deep-rooted cultural and moral frameworks that had long defined warfare in feudal society. For centuries, the image of the knight had stood at the center of military prestige and social order. These were warriors raised from childhood to uphold ideals of courage, honor, and noble conduct in battle. Combat was viewed not merely as a matter of killing the enemy, but as a test of individual valor and martial skill, carried out in a manner that reflected one's rank and reputation. The crossbow disrupted this model entirely. It allowed a relatively untrained foot soldier to kill an armored nobleman from a concealed position, with no warning and often with no opportunity for retaliation. That shift was not just practical, it was symbolic. It introduced a form of warfare that bypassed skill, removed personal confrontation, and reduced the ritualistic structure of combat to something cold and mechanical. The noble class saw this as not only dangerous to their battlefield dominance, but also to their moral authority. The notion that a commoner could bring down someone of high birth with a single impersonal shot was deeply unsettling. This moral discomfort was not merely theoretical. It was serious enough that the Catholic Church attempted to intervene, declaring the use of crossbows against Christians as morally unacceptable. The concern wasn't rooted in religious doctrine alone. It was a reflection of how unsettling this weapon was to the existing order. War had always been brutal, but the crossbow made it feel less human. It turned battle from a clash of honorable opponents into a contest of ambushes, sudden death, and reduced dignity. As time passed and new technologies emerged, particularly firearms, these psychological and moral concerns deepened. Gunpowder weapons amplified the sense that war was becoming more about mass destruction than personal courage. The battlefield grew noisier, bloodier, and less distinguishable from chaos. The chivalric ideals that had once defined medieval warfare began to fade. Strategic firepower replaced personal bravery as the decisive factor in combat. The crossbow marked the start of this transformation, not because it was the most powerful weapon of its time, but because it changed the way war was perceived by both soldiers and society. It challenged the belief that war should be fought according to class, code, or tradition, and instead introduced a more utilitarian and impersonal era of conflict. Number 7. The end of the knight's world. By the late Middle Ages, the image of the knight as the central figure in warfare began to erode under the pressure of evolving military structures, technological progress, and shifting political priorities. For centuries, heavily armored mounted warriors had dominated the battlefield, not just through physical strength and skill, but through the authority that came with their noble status. Warfare during the early medieval period had revolved around the assumption that mounted elites were the decisive force in combat. Their armor, their training, and their social role were all bound together in a system where power and battlefield effectiveness were deeply intertwined. However, as military realities began to change, this model started to collapse. The crossbow had already begun to challenge the idea that only the nobility had the power to determine the course of a battle. It allowed common infantry to threaten even the most well-equipped knight, forcing a re-evaluation of what kinds of soldiers mattered on the field. But it was far from the only factor. The increasing use of pike formations, made up of disciplined foot soldiers trained to stand their ground against cavalry charges, demonstrated that coordinated infantry could stop even the most aggressive mounted attack. Long bowmen, especially in regions where their use was culturally ingrained and widely practiced, proved devastating in pitched battles by delivering sustained, deadly volleys from a distance. What followed was a redefinition of military success. The rise of early artillery and the spread of handheld firearms introduced a level of destructive power that armor could no longer effectively resist. The knight, once an untouchable figure in full plate, became more of a liability than an asset in open combat. Heavy armor restricted movement and offered no guarantee of protection against gunpowder weapons. The battlefield was no longer about individual clashes of honor. It became a coordinated space, shaped by logistics, timing, and formations. This transition was also tied to broader political changes. As kingdoms centralized and rulers moved away from relying on feudal levies, they began to organize permanent armies made up of paid professionals and conscripts. These forces were drilled, equipped uniformly, and managed through emerging state bureaucracies. In that kind of system, individual heroism mattered less than the efficiency of the whole. The crossbow had helped pave the way for this transformation by proving that high-born warriors were not invincible. But it couldn't maintain its place in a world where adaptability, mass production, and firepower set the rules. In the end, the knightly class, once the face of medieval war, became a symbol of a past era. Respected, but no longer decisive.